Robiul, also known as Robert Pledge, is an old friend. He's someone we've been associated for a very long time. With Chobi Mela, there's a particular involvement because Robert and I co-curated the first exhibit, The War We Forgot, an incredible exhibition on 1971, which we put together for the first festival that we had. But Robert has also been involved at many levels. We've been in the World Press jury together. Robert was one of the early teachers of Pathshala. And one of the things that's interesting, we've been talking about conflict here. The person he's going to talk about, Don McCullin, is one of the old school of concerned photojournalists who really looked at photographing conflict because they wanted their work to bring about change. We talked to Gary and Lima earlier, Monica, two very different approaches, looking at the personal, looking at the public. Monica looking at the trends that are taking place within photography today. But with Robert, it's also interesting to go back to the sort of relationships picture editors, agencies had with their photographers, how they worked together, how they were part of a team. That collaboration that took place is now not really there in the same way. Robert, in particular, as joint president with David Burnett of Contact Press Images, has represented some of the great photographers of our time and continues to represent people like Salgado, people like Annie Leibovitz, David Burnett, and Don McCullin. So he will today be talking about Don McCullin. We were very fortunate recently. Rupert sitting here, Robert and I, we were all at Tate Britain about 10 days ago, and Don took us round, showed us around the exhibit, so that was a huge treat. I'm not going to talk about Don's work as such, because Robert is doing that, but I'll just tell you a little bit about something which Per Anders is here somewhere, no? Yeah, Per Anders is there. So I was at a festival in Christensen, where Don was also there, and we began talking about the famous iconic image of the man carrying the woman, dying woman, but what he wanted to tell me about was the woman lived. That was what he was excited about. It's a very powerful image, and it's become an iconic image, which is also problematic in some ways. But while we got talking, I also asked him about this very famous picture, and I'm sure that'll come up. It's in Vietnam. There's a soldier hurling a grenade, and he's got the arm up there, the grenade's in the air, and he's photographed all of that, and how photojournalists manage to do these things in split seconds in war conditions, I have no idea. The soldier was injured afterwards, but what he talked about was that he took a light meter reading shortly before that. And his comment was, you don't want to die for the wrong exposure. So that's Don McCullin. I mean, Robert will be explaining the work itself. Don's work has changed a lot over the years, and certainly the more recent work, what he's doing now is landscapes, beautiful landscapes, but very dour, dark, heavy landscape. And in a way, to me, it also talks about how war affects a person, how it changes a person. And he's, more than anything else, what I found about the person, and we wanted Don to come, he doesn't like long flights, so perhaps some other day, but what I found about him is that deep humanity that he has, and the humility this man does. I have never seen or heard of him talking, there you are, you saved me from a long speech. Well done. So, I'm not going to do any more. Are you up there? Or it's up there. So, anyway, I told them, gave away all the vital secrets. It's all yours.
Make it easier. Easier. Right? He must have said a few nice things. because usually I don't get this sort of a welcome. Sorry. But I'm happy to be here in Chobi Mela again. I believe it's my 5th time. It could be the 4th, 5th, let's see if it sounds better. And attended the very first one. So I'm happy to be here on such a historical day. Kosa? Yes, let me know if you don't hear me.
It could be better.
It could be better? I do like the pop singers, very close to Fine. No, it's a great day also because Shahidul is with us. And it's not just the pleasure of having us with us. This thing wouldn't happen if he wasn't here in the first place. So you're indispensable. Thank you. I'm going to speak about Don McCullin, or I'm going to show Don McCullin more than speak about him if I can. Not that words don't mean anything, but pictures sometimes say more. And I will disagree with my friend Gary Knight here. No, on a very specific point, 2 of them actually, but the first one is, you mentioned 3 important, very important photographers indeed, who covered the Vietnam War. 3 Brits, 1 Welsh, Don McCullin, Philip John Griffith, and Larry Bowers. Larry Bowers, who lost his life in Southeast Asia, as we know. But there's a 4th photographer, who I think is equally important, and nobody knows, nor remembers, or so little. And this photographer is a woman, and a remarkable one. Catherine Leroy was a very petite photographer who weighed 40 kilos or 85 pounds, thereabout, and who was the only woman war photographer or photographer covering the war in Vietnam at the height of the military activity, 1966, 1967, 1968. And we're going to rediscover her. We've been working on bringing her work to the public. There's a website that exists that I strongly recommend you go and visit. It's a very scholarly website, and you discover an extraordinary photographer who really gave herself entirely to her coverage of that terrible conflict that, as we know, shaped our world of today. I mean, it politically, geopolitically, and in many ways changed things very dramatically for the entire world. There were tensions all over the place, fights in America, protests, and in the rest of the world at the height of the Cold War, and so on and so forth. There's another woman photographer I would like to mention because it's very important. Nobody knows her either. She died actually in November 1965, just a few months before Catherine Leroy arrived in Vietnam. And they had never heard of each other, know each other, but Dickie Chappelle, the American photographer who died in November 65, was also somebody really important, though she was only covering the early part of the conflict. So there are 4 great photographers, and one of them is a woman. For the microphone. Thank you. Thank you. No. You had a hammock too? Great. This is terrific. Oh my God. This is luxurious. You have to come to Bangladesh for this. Thank you. Now, before showing you the pictures, and I'm going to show them to you twice, just to annoy you a little bit. And the first time, we'll run through them without a single word, at 1 second per image. That's the way actually editors work, or even photographers, they first look at their work. And we'll just get a sense of who this photographer might be. Some of you know already, others not. And then we'll go through and we'll speak, and you'll ask questions along the way, so that we don't have to keep everything for the end. But there's one word that really bothered me very much in the discussion earlier, speaking about war photography, was that concept of the spectacular. War is anything but spectacular. War has never sold a magazine. Magazines have run stories, Life and Look and Paris Match and Stern and the London Sunday Times, all this, of course, pre-existing the digital age, and they never sold more copies because of war pictures in it. That is a myth. That is an untruth. What sold magazines were celebrities and royalties, and always were, and other stories and lifestyles. Actually, war photography occupied the smallest part of any publication. If you look statistically through magazines, you realize that what is considered as conflict and war photography is the smallest part of the editorial content of publications. Yet, it is the only thing we remember. And there is a reason for that. It's that it is important, it is significant, it does create, provoke curiosity, create anxiety, emotions of all kinds, etc., pushes people to take action or not, to become more concerned or indifferent. It has many ramifications. So I think we need to get rid of some of these concepts that don't stand. So here we go. We're going to try. Oh, okay. And I've got to take my glasses off. So we just take the first one. Okay, you're the expert. Yes. Yes, you know, I was really very well prepared for this, and then the minute we made a test, everything went wrong, and we had glitch after glitch, and we had to change. Thank you to our remarkable team. We changed everything around, and hopefully it's going to work. At 5 this morning, it was working fine. Okay, so now we're going to just run through the pictures without speaking. Maybe we should turn this light on. Well, let me just say a few things then that are not related directly to the pictures, but to Don McCullin. Don McCullin is 83 years old, lives in England, in Somerset, with his third wife and fifth child. He's been married 3 times, clearly, but has 5, no, well, because he had a child of someone he was not married with, and he was married with somebody he had no child with. I mean, that's interesting from an anthropological point of view. But there's a reason why I'm saying this also, is that this man who's had a rather interesting and full life, often says that he feels he was a very bad father, but he's raised 5 children, and they're all fantastic and successful. So you can be a war photographer, and you can have children and love affairs, and be, and raise your kids in a way that they are happy. And that's what he's done, and I admire him tremendously for that, because many of my friends are not quite in that position, who didn't have a life that was quite as adventurous. He is the first photojournalist and the second photographer ever to be knighted by the Queen of England, which for most, again, my password, and you want my credit card too?
Stop. I remember.
I'm going to have to, I think this should be it.
Anyway, sorry.
Well, so now we should just go to the first one. We have a team of surgeons here who are doing very well, and so the first knighted photographer was Cecil Beaton. No, most people don't remember who he is, except if you're Brit. Oh yes, you do. Good. Oh, well, great. There'll be a few lollipops distributed later as a reward for this. Okay. This gives a sense of who this man is. There's something very dark about everything here, would you say? It's printed dark. These scans were actually made from his own prints. He prints. He's one of the few photographers I know who still prints all his images, and has been doing so for almost 60 years. A few times, because of deadlines in New York or in London, the film was processed and printed maybe by others. But 95% of the existing prints were done by him in his lab. There's a very personal relationship between those prints and himself. The prints are his voice, and the scans don't do exact justice to it. If you have a chance, which probably most of you won't, except for more privileged, there's an extraordinary retrospective of his work at Tate Britain in London. He is the first living artist to, he hates that word, by the way. He rejects it completely. He's a photographer, but he is nonetheless the first living artist ever to be given a retrospective at Tate Britain, the year after he was knighted. Now, these things, knighthood and retrospective at Tate Britain, do not impress him. And when you congratulate him, or when I congratulated him, he would always say, "Isn't this great for photography?" It was not for him. He doesn't care about being called Sir Donald, which is how I call him now. And he said, no, you don't have to. You can call me Don. He doesn't care for himself. The retrospective, he cares for the people who are going to come and look at the photographs. That is his rapport with his photography. If you agree, we'll just go through it at a more leisurely pace. I'll make some comments, you'll ask some questions, if you have any, and we'll ping-pong back and forth. I never feel quite comfortable speaking on his behalf, sort of, speaking and analyzing his images. He has he doesn't like people to do that too much, but since he's not here, we'll take advantage of it. But in a respectful way. So we go back to the first one, we'll put it on maybe. 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 12 seconds. Yes, the transition. So I tell you, as we go along a little bit, his story, his journey. He comes from an impoverished background, born in 1935, and therefore he was a kid during the war. And during the war he was actually evacuated from London because of the bombing and sent with his two siblings, a sister and a brother. They were sent in different homes. His sister was very fortunate to be greeted by a very wealthy family who finally adopted her. But the two boys were less fortunate. And that certainly determined a lot of things in his life. His father died at the age when Don was 14, and it was a very deeply impactful event in his life. He had a very dominant and sometimes violent mother. And why all this information? Because it helps to understand who he is and why he is or has been all these years the way he has been. He often says that he was shaped by war, and I think that's an extraordinary expression as far as he is concerned. Born in 35, he was therefore 4 years old when the war broke out, and he lived through the war. In England was not a very easy and pleasant thing, but after the war, other conflicts took place, and he learned about them. And he did his national service when he was 19 years old, which allowed him to travel a bit. Oh, I'm not speaking to the images, am I? And you're not even telling me that I'm hiding the images. And let me stop here, this image. See, this is what is left of the temple of God. Do we have to have this slide here? Yes, okay. Oh, because of Hollywood. I got it. Well, what happened here? So this is the Temple of Baal in Palmyra after ISIS destroyed it, except for this portico here, which, if I go back one image, is what you see right here in the middle. So that's the way it was, and it is now. Now, these images that you've just seen are from several years of work around the basin of the Mediterranean Sea, from Morocco all the way to Syria, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, then Lebanon, Syria, etc. And it's a study of the traces of the Roman Empire. They are landscapes, but they are war pictures also. Why the Roman Empire? Why this passion for the Roman Empire? How do I stop these things every now and then? Thank you. Because the Roman Empire was built, among other things, on military force, on aggression, repression, and domination. It generated a great civilization of which Europe and the Western world benefited tremendously, and maybe part of the rest of the world also to some extent. But it was also rather a tough world. And in a way, it is both landscape and war, and a reflection on humanity and on power and on the usage of violence and warfare to dominate. So now we're going to follow his life in a more chronological order. With his childhood, you saw a few images, and this was the street where he lived for many years, and this car belonged to a boxer who was quite famous. That was the only luxury in the neighborhood. Images he took in Liverpool here, but he got into photography because of his military national service that allowed him to travel, as I said earlier, to Kenya, to Aden, to Cyprus. He was hoping, he worked at the Royal Air Force lab, hoping that he might become a photographer, but he was told that he would not become one because he was not good enough. So he left the army a little dejected, and he actually pawned his camera that he had bought in Kenya. And a year later, his mother redeemed the camera for £5, and he started taking pictures. His first pictures were about the gangs of his neighborhood, Finsbury Park, which is in the north of London, a rather then impoverished and derelict area. And some of these gang members got involved in the murder of a policeman. They were arrested and sent to jail. And he often says, probably rightfully so, that the camera saved him. Photography saved him, changed his life. Had he not had this camera, he would probably have ended in jail, actually, or would have had trouble with the law, like his brother did, who ended up joining the French Foreign Legion to escape English justice. Whereas the older sister, who he lost complete track of, did very well, on the contrary. So his first images are in London, protest, demonstration here, an anti-fascist rally that ended taking him to Berlin in the summer of 1961, when he was on his honeymoon in Paris and saw an image in a local newspaper of this East German soldier jumping over the barbed wire to escape to the west. And he understood that something was happening in Berlin, asked his wife if she would mind him going to Berlin immediately. He had very little money enough to buy a ticket, went to Berlin, and took these pictures that he then proposed to several English newspapers. The Observer published them like they had his first gang images, and that launched his career. As he said, Berlin was his first international war, a Cold War, but a war that almost became an international confrontation. His first violent war, hot war, if you will, was Cyprus. And he's in 1964. The Observer sent him there, and he brought back images that would actually get him recognition, not only because they were published, but because the World Press Photo attributed him the premier award for that year. He had not applied for it. It was nominated by his newspaper, and that definitely launched his career. And you start seeing the way he approaches conflict. The main subject seemed to be the people who are the most affected negatively by by war, by conflict, the civilians, the mothers, the children. And that is a thread you'll find throughout his work. It is not so much the action. He is not interested in what the event is per se, but concerned about the people whose lives are transformed, changed, and destroyed by warfare, by conflict, by military intervention. Here we're in the Congo, a very brutal civil war at that stage was going on, that was nurtured by the former colonial power, Belgium in this case. Mercenaries were involved here, a Rhodesian mercenary in the Congo. The scene was pretty ugly. The Middle East, of course, he went to in 1967, then the October War, no, the June War, 1967, and from there on he would be on one conflict after another, because he chose to go there. He was not sent by the newspapers anymore. He had joined since the London Sunday Times magazine and worked very consistently. He had a contract with them, which was a pretty miserable contract when you think of it, really. But it gave him a lot of freedom to go where he wanted to. And of course, Vietnam is a conflict he covered in a very different way, actually, than other photographers do. People like Philip John Griffith, for instance, or Larry Bowers and Catherine Leroy were there for extended periods of time, of a year or 2 years or 3 years in the case of Leroy, and Larry Bowers maybe even longer. Whereas Don went there 18 times over the course of 10 or 12 years, spending anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 weeks in a particular area, and very notably during the Battle of Hue in January, February of 1968. I'm showing you these pictures in greater abundance maybe than on other subjects, if only because this happened 50 years ago. It was spoken a lot about in the American media in particular, and his images were actually, for the very first time in America, quite abundantly used over most other American photographers' work. They probably sustain time better than most work that has been done, and maybe precisely because of the content of his approach, of the way he looks at this. By the way, I'll go back one picture if I may. This is the only posed image that he says he ever did. You see, these two American soldiers are stealing stuff from this Viet Cong soldier who was killed, not by any of them, any of these two guys. And Don was so shocked that a combatant, even your enemy, would be mistreated in this way, and the lack of respect that these soldiers were showing. So he wanted to keep a trace of the existence of this man, and he spread out his belongings that were there on the ground in a way that he could produce what is more of an illustration and anything, and he's proud of that image. For him it's a very important one, and the only one, an exception in the work he has done. This is a rather famous photograph, the Shell-Shock Marine, as it is called. Actually, just recently, several of his images have led to interesting inquiries about particular situations and have allowed to identify a number of soldiers who were killed. We're going to see, if we haven't already, a soldier on a tank. The Washington Post claimed that the man was alive, and they even interviewed him. The New York Times did a much more in-depth investigation and concluded that the man was actually dead, did not survive his wounds. So there's a very, very long story that was published just 10 days ago in the New York Times, and it's remarkable how photographs take on a life of their own that is totally independent from the intention of the photographer. Biafra was a terrible civil war in southeast Nigeria, the biggest, most populated country in West Africa. The Igbos were seeking independence. The federal government, backed actually by the Brits, the government crushed this rebellion over almost 2-year period. It generated several million deaths. Malnutrition was a main factor, and of course the deaths were primarily of civilians, as is the case in most conflicts, as we know, and we know today. If you look at the situation in Syria in particular, Biafra did have a tremendous impact, stirred a lot of reactions in Europe in particular. And these women he photographed are on the average 16 to 18 years of age. He took these portraits. It's quite actually amazing because they are all vertical images. It is one of the rare times he photographed that way. This young 16-year-old kid, Patience is her name, agreed to be photographed. He gets their permission, in other words, not by speaking to them necessarily, by looking at them, by nodding at them, and that is his approach. This is where he was seriously injured in Cambodia. This man we just saw died himself, but Don was less badly injured and taken good care of and naturally survived. Unlike this bird, and this bird was not in Cambodia, I'm telling you, for information. These are among the first English landscapes that Don produced. They're very dark, they're very bleak. They're what he calls his images of peace. His vision of peace is a rather dark one and pessimistic one. Northern Ireland, the beginning of the Troubles, this confrontation between these young Catholic kids and the British Army and the Protestant police. This is a rather well-known image also of the charge of these British soldiers chasing these kids. I mean, it was a cat and mouse situation, but rather, as we maybe remember, a rather violent one, and that lasted many years. Brexit perturbed that peace that was established or not, that we will know in the weeks and months ahead. Now, Bangladesh. Professor Saban, is that his name? Yes. Yesterday he made reference to Dr. McCullin and his images in 71 war of liberation, when close to possibly 10 or 12 or more million people were displaced and ended up in camps along the border with India. Cholera became a major epidemic. These people traveled from all over the country to escape that short 9-month-long conflict that was devastated, but that led to the independence of Bangladesh, and which is maybe one of the reasons we're here tonight, because Bangladesh does exist and Shahidul. Hello, these are what tough images. You know, I'm showing you something like less than 180 images in total for a 60-year career, which represents about 2.5 images a year. It's very little. It's very, very little for such. So I'm not doing justice to these subjects by making it so short, so tight, but the images are powerful. They have, at least I feel, impact. At the Tate Britain, there are about twice as many as I'm presenting to you tonight. So that tells you that his work is very dense and very rich, if you will. He goes back and forth between these wars abroad and the English countryside, the London, but there's a common thread always, which is born from his childhood, this concern for how human beings are treated by others, and his focus is on the victims of all these wars that are also social and economic: poverty, lack of education are, of course, amongst the realities. This man, actually, I should tell you this story. This man has a name, or a nickname. Neptune is his name. And when we did a big retrospective of Don's work in Germany, CO Berlin did a big poster, a big banner in front of the museum. And they also printed little cards. They were very beautiful, very little cards, almost a stamp size, or a little bit stamp size image. And that image was on these cards. And when we arrived at the hotel, on the counter, there was a little pile of these images. So there was the image and Don McCullin's name, the title of the show. The woman behind the counter asked for his passport to register him. He gave the passport to her, and she looked at it very carefully and looked at the image and said to him, "You look much better now than on this picture." That was quite an extraordinary moment. Don didn't know what to say, but it's true. If you remember that earlier picture we saw, and we'll see again, there is some resemblance, if you will. But that is true in portraiture. These portraits are Don McCullin as much as they are the people he's photographing. And they're white, and they're black, and they're brown, and they're different. But they are his look. They are his gaze. His gaze, he is looking at them, and he is looking back at himself, and he's questioning himself. There is something, I think, rather profound in the way he establishes this rapport and the meaning he gives. He's not somebody who's ideological or intellectual, or his images are strong. Basically, I think, because his intent is to shame people who refuse to look at these realities that are happening around the world or in their neighborhood. That is more maybe a moral attitude, although he's not a moralist in any way. He's a pessimist in many ways, on the contrary, but there's something quite unique in the way he looks at people and people look back at him, which is something constant throughout his work. And you'll notice that he is most often at eye level. He's fairly close, but not too close, sometimes a little more, sometimes. And it's always by consent, by tacit consent. Cambodia, that's part of his 18 trips to Southeast Asia. He was in Phnom Penh just before the fall of Phnom Penh that was taken over by the Khmer Rouge. Then he finds himself in Lebanon, this image at the Intercontinental Hotel. Also an area he would visit many times. He actually himself met Catherine Leroy in Vietnam and in Lebanon, in the Middle East. They knew each other. He had a lot of admiration for her courage, her guts. He didn't know her pictures very well, but nobody did, because she worked for a wise service, and only those few pictures that were sent out and published in newspapers are somewhat remembered, but the bulk of the work was never seen otherwise. Unlike Don's work that was published in the magazine, he worked with a great art director, Michael Rand, who attended at the age of 90 the opening at Tate Britain, and there was this very extraordinary relationship between the editor, Harold Evans, the art director, Michael Rand, and David King, the art editor, and it was a collaboration that after Harold Evans resigned from the newspaper, vanished, and a year later Don was actually fired by the new editor of the London Sunday Times. He entered a period of great concern and uncertainty, I would say, revisiting England more abundantly, and producing really the beginning of what are his British landscapes. But social landscapes were, of course, first, and then we'll see the others in a bit. But he comes back to the same themes all the time, whether it's in England or in Bangladesh or in India or in Africa. It's the same subject. We were speaking with Raghu Rai yesterday about this, where Raghu rightfully was feeling that his images from India that are part of the book called Don McCullin's India are not representative of the country, and they're not, but they're representative of something else, a social reality that exists in India like it exists in England, like it exists in the United States and every country, in proportions that might vary, but there is something that's, and that's what Don focuses on, is these people, these groups, these communities that are totally rejected or marginalized or exploited or repressed or oppressed, and all of the above. Francis Bacon is a painter that he likes and he photographed, one of the few. But once again, there's no mystery there. There's something as dark and bleak in Francis Bacon's work as there is in Don McCullin's. It becomes less international. In those portraits is an extraordinary face, this woman, and that's what Don does. He gets into still lives and landscapes also. Travels quite a bit to Indonesia, where he spent quite a lot of time actually traveling with a famous writer, Norman Lewis. I'm showing you two photographs. It's ludicrous, but it gives a sense of the extension of his travels and the extent of his travels. And India, of course. India, where he has been going back very regularly, or did, over a long period of time along the Ganges River in particular. And that work is part of his landscapes of peace, if you will, where it finds a certain form of serenity, although one might, or maybe the pictures convey a different feeling. Images I'm showing you right now that really bother Raghuvai, right, in a legitimate way, of course, from his perspective, naturally. It's not, and Don never intended to make a fair representation of Indian society. That was not his concern, and was his concern in no other place, even in the UK. He had decided to quit photographing war, but when the war broke out in Iraq, it didn't break out, as we know. It was organized and in a pretty forceful fashion. Well, he went back and he tried, and of course it was very difficult. He was in the northern part of Iraq, where the Kurds are. He couldn't go much further down. He was very frustrated. As he was frustrated, not being able to cover the British War of the Falklands, the British government absolutely made sure that he would not get any access and would not be able to be present in the Falklands when that war took place in the early 80s. But Southern Africa, decimated by AIDS, became the new war he wanted and planned to cover, which he did. And he did with the help of an NGO and an American foundation, and spent a lot of time in Zambia, South Africa, Botswana, covering this, what he called his war against humanity, the AIDS epidemic in Southern Africa that has had dramatic consequences, decimating hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Africa was always a continent that he liked to visit, and went not only to Southern Africa but also to the Ethiopian area, the southern part of Ethiopia, where these so-called lost tribes were living in the cut off from modern society, and he was quite taken by this and spent quite a bit of time until he realized that even in these tribes, sticks were being replaced by AK-47s that could be bought at $5 a piece, part of the trafficking of weaponry in that part of the world after the demise of the Soviet Union. But after going back and forth between Ethiopia and the wealthy British, the eccentric wealthy British, he didn't make this comparison. I took the liberty to edit it that way, which probably he would not approve of, but I couldn't quite resist, and there is something indeed exotic in both cases, but it's once again a very relative notion and a matter of perspective. His landscapes. Somerset, primarily, where he lives, and this is very close to the house where he does live, but also Scotland and other parts of England, but Somerset primarily, because of their skies, because of the skies there, which for him are so important. Skies and music, that's his main concern when he is in his lab. The skies speak to him, and the music also. They work together. And his images, and he's haunted by his own images, and that's why he wants to print them himself, because he does not feel that anybody else could do justice to them, and he wants to never forget, and by printing them in the old-fashioned way in his lab is a way of not forgetting the past ever. However successful he has become, pretty dark images. But back to Africa also, to Sudan in particular, his interest in archaeology here, the Hadrian Wall in England, between Scotland and England, well, that takes us back to the Roman Empire. And these other traces of great empire, Egypt, the Pharaoh, but these are the pyramids in Sudan of the black pharaohs that for many years were, because of war actually had been, and conflict in the area, had been completely banned. And last year, Don went to France, to La Somme, where some of the fiercest battles of World War I took place. And this is another and a recent landscape of war by Sir Donald. A few pictures of him. You should see a few pictures of him when he was a child. He's the one on the right-hand side with this being shaped by war. When he was, just before he joined, he went to do his national service. Photographed by his friend Gilles Caron, another great photographer who died just a year or two later. At the age of 30, he disappeared in Cambodia, Don in Afghanistan, and then, of course, the way he looks today. We're back to where we started. Thank you very much. I'm sure I'm not sure at all. There might be a few questions. I'm happy to try and answer if you want me to. Rupert is always ready. You're first. After all, he is, you know Don McCullin, and
Robert, thank you very much for that. It was very illuminating and an important analysis of the way he's been. And I think he's had a huge influence on so many lives, probably in this room included. Could you just a very simple question, could you say a little bit about his early life and how the photograph of the gangland, which we passed over rather quickly because that was a difficult point in the technology, how did he get commissioned for that? How did he get that in the Observer? Was that his first ever published photograph?
yes, he got his camera back from the pawn shop and started taking pictures and hanging out with his friends who were members of different gangs. And one of the gangs, the governors, was the one he was closest to, got involved in the murder of a policeman. He had photographed them. When the story broke out, when the arrests were made, some of his friends said, you should get these pictures published. So he went to the Observer and showed the photographs, and they were immediately published. That big group portrait of the 7 members of the gang in the building, of the destroyed building, was his first published picture ever.
And was that a war?
But I'm not sure. I was Finsbury Park was a pretty bad area, quite damaged. I don't know where. It's changed today. I think it's probably a very trendy place, and yes, you know, but I don't know. But you know, the context in which he grew was all shaped by war. Everything was about war. You know, the news. I mean, that's what he grew up in. He felt he lived it, so he saw war everywhere. The traces of it. They existed. He didn't invent anything. That's why he says, I'm not an artist, I'm not a creator. These things exist. I see them because I have the vibes. I mean, it's something I know about. I grew up with it. I'm a child of Hitler. That's one of the expressions he used. Often, not so much anymore, but shaped by war is probably the best expression. It's something he lived through and he knows about.
Robert, I was one of the privileged few, as you said, to see the exhibition in the Tate of Don McCullin's, and obviously it's an overwhelming experience. But later, I think a couple of days later, I also heard his interview that Don gave. I think it was on ITV. And he was asked the question that whether his images had changed the course of the war. And he said no. He thought they did not have an impact on the course of the war. And I was rather surprised by that. What drove him to take those images and try and impact, have such a powerful impression upon the public? And yet he believed that the war continued with a life of its own. So where does that leave us with the whole philosophy of war photography and of Don's in the first place?
Yeah, it's an issue it's something that torments him, having spent so much time in conflicts, covering conflicts, showing terrible, atrocious things, or showing how ordinary people are destroyed, are affected so deeply by this. He speaks about it quite abundantly in his autobiography. Unreasonable Behavior. I strongly recommend you read it. It's a good read, and there's an updated version because the book was published in 1991, I believe, and it was reprinted several times. And after a while, the publishers realized that he had lived another 30 or 40 years, and maybe that should be dealt with also in his autobiography. Yes, he feels that he went to all these places, but in effect, his images, however powerful they might seem, have had no impact. They haven't changed the course of things in any way. And he's probably right. There's a form of despair in his feeling in that regard, and that's why he's very ambivalent about even the title being called Sir Donald. I think there's some pride, you know, for somebody, a working class kid who could have ended up in jail, who is now recognized by the establishment, his Sir Donald. He laughs at it. He thinks it's rather funny sometimes. And to have he who never wanted, I remember the very first interview I did of him in 1970 or 71, he said, "My pictures are not meant to be hung on a wall. They're not meant for the galleries or the museums. They're meant to be seen in print, in magazines, on a Sunday morning when people are having breakfast, and they should disturb him. Disturb them." That was his thing. And today he's grateful that walls exist that are willing to welcome his images. And it's his last attempt and his hope that maybe at least they will lead to some reflection, looking back at these events that are the same as they are today, in different time, in different place, but they're the same. They are Syria, they are all these conflicts that have been taking place. There's no difference. But he feels that, well, his power is, yes, Madam.
Yes, you were talking about how war has shaped his photography. But most of these wars are wars of empire. Most of the wars he covered are wars of empire as well. So do you think there is any critical awareness of that in his work?
That he is aware of?
That these wars are wars of empire.
You know?
Of imperial, that these are imperial wars. I mean, is there any critical, I mean, to go back to, let's say, what Vanessa was talking about the legacy of empire and how that has shaped her photography. So in Don's work,
yes.
I mean, war has shaped his photography. It has given shape.
Yes.
But that these wars are wars of empire, is there any awareness, any critical awareness of that in his work?
Yes, it's very strange what microphones do to people who are hard of hearing. You're mentioning the empire,
yes,
the Roman Empire.
No. The US
British,
Empire,
the British
Empire, yes.
Well,
and the continuing legacy of
when he's speaking of the Roman Empire, he's speaking of the British Empire, he's speaking of all the empires, you know, and their legacy for the better and for the worse, and how they end up self-destroying in some ways. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, knighthood doesn't really, I mean, you know, there are people who have refused knighthood because it is a legacy of empire. So I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yes, his conscious of that reality knows he's not only shaped by war, but shaped by the world in which he grew up, and it shapes his perspective. Of course, and I guess a number of places he went to were very much determined by that. He, you know, the Middle East and South Asia, places went to more so than South America, for instance, and that's not by coincidence. But for him, he was, I guess, it's not, yes, interested in the universal dimension of it, but it's not that so much that his refusal to accept that people could be treated the way they were and that other people could treat others the way they did. That is really what is at the heart, I think, of his whole own unreasonable behavior.
Robert,
Yes, sir.
just to be specific, so just because we have worked on the archive of Roshid Talukdar, who was one of the most
Yes.
important photographer in last few decades in Bangladesh, and while we are looking at his images about the 71 war in Bangladesh, there's something very interesting I noticed, and we were discussing it between us, that what kind of difference it makes when you photograph your own people or where you belong, and when you know the war is actually affecting you by bits and pieces, and you're not photographing it as only as a journalist, and it's not about being objective, it's not about being in the right spot, but when it affects you from top to bottom, and when you don't travel from war to war, and when you don't see people dying from Libya to Afghanistan to Iraq, then people becomes numbers to you. Of course, there are contents. And this whole practice in photojournalism, where people move from one place to another place by planes and the land. And of course, they have training, they have skills. But do you think there's any difference when you photograph your own people and when you are affected by it in whatever way, and when you have that distance?
Well, the interesting thing about McCullin, I think, is precisely this, that he's traveled to all these different areas of disasters where dreadful things were happening, but he traveled all over England. He photographed his own people in the same way, with the same look, with the same concern. And I think that's what makes him very unique. Yes, when he started and under his national service, he picked up the camera, he got published, then he got this World Press, which he never asked to receive. He never asked to receive any awards, actually. He never applies for any of them. It's not, today everybody wants to get a World Press Award, so everybody applies. He never applied, ever, for any of them. He didn't apply to be knighted either. But this has come quite naturally because of who he is, the way he does things, the way he's recognized, I guess. But he would have been equally happy to stay in England and do even more work there. But circumstances, and in the early stages, coming from the background he came from, he wanted to discover the world. The Royal Air Force allowed him to do that a little bit during his national service. But after that, he wanted to go further and wanted to see. So each time there was that opportunity, and he would choose the conflicts. He went to Cyprus because he had been to Cyprus. He had, during his national service, he went to Africa. There were areas that were somewhat familiar, that he had connected with somehow. And then, I guess, South Asia, it's part of the British myth, and the Raj, and he was curious. And so I don't know what the answer is. I think you can, it's an old discussion. I mean, the French poets, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, had discussion for ages, said, you should go abroad, you should see what's happening. And the other one would say, no, you should stay at home and you should speak about the world from where you are. I think that applies to photography to some extent. I think Bangladesh, by the way, I had to say something, absolutely, that Don McCullin has a tremendous admiration for Bangladeshi photographers. He is the honorary chairman of the Nigel Parry Award. And every year, there are entries from all over. And the ones in the last 10 or 15 years, he's mentioned it to me over and over, because he knows I come to this faraway land, a friend of Shahidul, And he said, it's hard to believe that a country like Bangladesh could produce so many great photographers. This, Shahidul, is a great compliment for you personally, but also for the talent and the work and he never says that of other people, you know. Or, yes, he said the French have always produced great photographers, and Cartier-Bresson and others, but he is really in awe of what has happened in Bangladesh. So I had to tell you.
Thanks, Bob. Building off, I guess, a couple of the questions and your comments, and also his reputation for being sort of uncomfortable with his legacy, and you know, I think that's well known about him. I'm wondering then, as a living artist with a retrospective at Tate Britain, and you know, we have that opportunity while he's alive. I guess my question is, have you or he considered other ways that we might be able to deal with his archive, rather than the sort of conventional rarefication and canonization that is obviously going on as he reaches the end of his life? Are there other things that we could, have you or he considered that? I guess.
Sure, it's a big question. It's something on his mind all the time. He wants to know that his archive will be somewhere safe for people to go and look at and consult. People who want to do research, people who want to know about things, and
I guess just
yes.
on Wasif's point, you know, like we're in an age now where people are sort of doing things with archives. They can be reactivated, they can be reimagined, they can be retransformed. I'm just wondering whether he or you had considered any of those.
Well, I don't think he himself, he says he's a little too old to himself engage in new activities, but he would be happy to know that his archive can be used for other purpose. And it's true that in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been a surprising number of usages, demands made for his work by publications that never paid any attention to him before. So there's an element of vindication there that his work might mean something after all, a little bit somewhere, somehow. But he's very cautious about it. He would like it. He thinks that maybe it's in France that it would be better for him to have his archive, because he thinks the French have more knowledge and interest in photography than the Brits do, and maybe he's right. But it's not a complete answer either to your question. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. Thank you.